Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I recently talked to a friend of mine who is asking me about the lines that I like to use and what type of brand I use for this application and what brand I use for this other technique. And the reality is, I like to keep my line choices very similar across the board based on types of rod and reel categories that I use. And I do that for a lot of reasons. And I think it's a big mistake that a lot of anglers actually end up doing, and that's using random brands and models of line across the board with all their rod and reels. What I mean by that is if you have four bait casting rod and reels and you've got four different brands of line across those four, you have to be extremely familiar with every one of those brands of line so that you know how it's going to impact your performance and you can make adjustments with that specific rod and reel throughout the day. That's something I think most of us probably can't do, myself included. I am one that does not waste much line. And, I think there's a perception that tournament anglers, professional level anglers, that we get all this line for free and we end up, just respooling every rod and reel after every tournament day. Maybe some guys do that. I sure don't do that. I have rods and reels that I may spool up at the beginning of each season and they got the same line on them throughout the majority of the year because I don't use them that much. But I'm not going to change the line just to change the line. But what that ends up doing for me is if I used a bunch of different brands of line, a bunch of different models, even within those brands, I probably would not be able to tell you what line specifically I've got on that rod and reel. And that's where the issue comes in. If you're not extremely familiar with that brand or that model of line that you've got on your reel, you are probably missing out on potentially determining how that line is going to impact your bait performance. And two, if you're not familiar with the line, you may end up not being familiar with the abrasion resistance ability of that line. And therefore, you end up breaking off fish that you should not have broken off in the first place. So, I'm going to tell you why I think it's a mistake to use a bunch of different types of line across all your rods and reels. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying, for me, I basically use two types of braid. I use two types of fluorocarbon, one monofilament. That's generally all the line that I use. I have one set of braid for all of my spinning rods as a backing for the braid or for the spinning rods. Generally, I'm looking for a braid that's got a much higher strand count. So the X9 Berkeley is made with 9 strands of line woven together, and that leads to a much smoother casting ability. So all of my spinning rods, which are finesse techniques, will have this as the backing. That's not the same braid though that I use for my bait casting rods. I actually go with a lower stranded line or braided line, like a Dura braid or the X5. And the reason for that is it tend to be better from an abrasion resistance standpoint. And I know that any bait casting rod I pick up, if there's braid on it, it's for going into like heavier cover. Now, my fluorocarbon is kind of the same way with my bait casting rods. I tend to prefer to use a fluorocarbon that is going to be thicker in diameter. Not that that's necessarily what I want, but that thicker diameter generally leads to a much better abrasion resistance fluorocarbon. So if I'm, fishing a swim jig all day, or if I'm fishing a spinnerbait all day and I've been fishing around wood, I want something that's got a little bit better abrasion resistance. And I'm willing to deal with the fact that it's got a little bit thicker diameter to it because of that. My spinning gear is generally a little bit different. I actually prefer to have a fluorocarbon line that's going to be thinner in diameter because it allows my baits, which are going to be more finesse based, the ability to move freely in the water column without being affected by my line dragging the bait down or, just preventing the bait from having true movement in the water. So for me, these are really important things to understand. And the reason for that is I know that anytime I pick up a bait cast rod, that these are going to be the lines, the model, the brand, the same line that I've used for years now, and I'm that familiar with it. I don't want to pick up a bait caster, get a big bass on, horse them through some wood and have it end up breaking off because, oh, I forgot that was the rod that had, a less abrasion resistance fluorocarbon, and therefore I broke them off. You want to be so familiar with your gear that you're not concerned with stuff like that. And what I mean by that is you may have two rods spooled with 15-pound fluorocarbon, and one you're pitching fish, pitching up fish all day long, pulling them out of laydowns. You have no problem at all, and then you pick up a spinnerbait that's got a different uh, a different 15-pound line by either the same brand but a different model, or a different brand altogether, and you horse on them the exact same way, the same amount of pressure that you applied to those fish that you were just flipping up out of laydowns, and you end up breaking that fish off because even though they're both rated 15 pounds, they don't perform the same way. One you can apply more force, one you can't apply that much more force. And from that standpoint, if you're not that familiar with your gear, you're better off having the same model, brand, line across the board. The other reason I'm going to say that this has an impact is, again, from a bait presentation standpoint. If I'm fishing, say, a jerk bait and I'm throwing it on 10-pound fluorocarbon, the bait will perform differently based on the line that I'm throwing. Not saying there's a perfect line for it, but you as an angler will get familiar to how that bait needs to be worked based on the line that you throw every day, versus you have three rods rigged up with all 10-pound tests and you randomly pick one. Your jerkbait's going to perform differently based on all three of those rods. That's going to create issues for you. So you may actually, think that the bite for the jerkbait's off, but it's the fact that the way you were working it with a different rod and a different line type is now actually preventing you from maybe getting your bait as deep the day before. So there's little nuances like that. If you get familiar with your bait and how to work your bait and generate strikes by not changing line, that's all you're going to be familiar with. So you know how to make those adjustments. But I think it's all too frequently you hear people breaking off fish, or having a technique that changed from day to day, and making such a minute adjustment of choosing a different line can actually really impart or impact the performance of that bait, and it's something that goes very, very often overlooked. This is why I feel like, for me as an angler at least, and why I recommend this to other anglers, it's very important to have the same brand align across the board with certain techniques. Now, again, I'm not saying every rod has to be the same exact line. I'm saying when you pick up a rod, you need to know what that line is and how it's going to perform on your bait. So when I know if I pick up a spinning rod, I've got Berkeley X9 braid, a smooth casting 9-strand braid across the board on every one of my spinning rods. So I know that, and then I'm going to have a 6, 8, or 10-pound leader of the exact same branded fluorocarbon on it. It's just one of those things. I'm familiar with it. I know I don't have to worry about it. But I think a lot of times anglers completely overlook the importance of this. So let me know in the comments section. Do you think I'm crazy? Should you just go out and buy whatever brand you can find that's on sale any time of the day and mix and mingle? Or should you try to stay within what you're familiar with and stay in certain categories of rod and reel techniques and use that single line across the board? I'd love to know what you guys think, but for me, this is what works best. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.